צריכה להיזהר עם הכבלים. שיבואו מכאן. בסדר?
קצת מסקינג טייפ, אולי תעשה.
כן, ואם אני אדלק על שני החדרים, שאלה, אני אציג אני מעדיף שלא. כן? בסדר. לא, יש לי מלא ריצות, כן. שלח לי אימייל, אני לא, כן, כן.
זה היה סיפור מיסה.
יש כיכר, בבית הכנסת מירון יש כיכר.
כן, כיכר. בטח כלימה?
דווקא שם התזכירו את העולם, חב"ד. שם עולם רוח.
אני פה?
Hello. Still how we Sonia said the same. It would be interesting. Wherever you get.
לא, קובע את בירתו. למה? כל מיני פרובינציות הונגריות מחוץ להונגריה. בסיבניה, בויבודינה. יש מונקה.
נדן.
שם ההונגרים. יש לו מערון שזה, והונגריה ויש לה בסוף. לא. יש שתי ערים מבחור
Because the wires are just a big mess. כל מי שצריך תרגום מאנגלית לעברית, שילך את אוזניות. זה פאנל כולו באנגלית.
It's exactly the same.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this session. Please, good afternoon and welcome to this session. My name is Miron and I come from the Hebrew University. Okay, I'll start again. Good afternoon and welcome to this session. My name is Miron and I come from the Hebrew University. My main field of research is German Jewish history, but I also dealt a couple of years with Hungarian Jewish history. I heard the lecture of Adam Ferziger this morning about the need of Israeli scholars to study the Hungarian language, and I'm one of these few who did some of the efforts to get to this language, and it's really a challenge if you don't come from this background. This topic that we have for this session, I find it very interesting. It's part of the unique experience of Hungarian Jewry. I was interested to get into this topic of Hungarian Jewry because some of the interesting similarities to the German Jewish experience of integration, of association with the local culture, etc., but this situation of the interwar period in which central parts of the Hungarian
זה בסדר. לא שומעים אותך בתרגום, לא שומעים אותך כי המיקרופון לא עובד.
Okay, I'll get to the last sentence. This situation in which Hungarian-speaking Jews found themselves living in new countries, in areas which were next to the new neighboring country, the successor states of Hungary, and the identity problems that it evoked, part of the bigger problems of Hungary on the Hungarian frontier in the interwar period, I think it's quite unique in Jewish history, and it poses a very interesting question of Jewish identity from the one hand, of questions of inter-ethnic relations in the other hand, and I find it a really fascinating case study in modern Jewish history at large. I think that one of the most interesting challenges of the research of Hungarian Jewish history is not only to keep it developed as a thing to itself, but also to implement some of its implications to a wider view of Jewish history at large. Because if it will be only an enclave of those interests specifically in Hungarian Jewish history, there is no future chance to the research. If, on the other hand, some of the problems unique in this context, and this is one of the unique problems, will be discussed in the wider context of Jewish history in general, this will be interesting also for future generations. We have 3 speakers here. The problem originally we had 4, but we have only 3 speakers. This will give us a little more time for a few questions and short discussion, I hope. Our first speaker is Dr. Lynda Mרגיטאי. Okay, Lynda Mרגיטאי. She's a PhD candidate in modern history at the University of Szeged and a participant in the Yellowstone Archive Research Group of Hungary. Her research interests include the implementation of the effects of Hungary's anti-Semitic laws. Originally they called the Jewish laws, but actually the anti-Semitic laws, the involvement of the non-Jews in the Aryanization process, and the social basis of the Eurocross party. The dissertation examines anti-Jewish policies, ethnic relations, and anti-Semitism in Hungarian occupied, now you have to help me, Bויבודינה? Bוivoudina during World War II, please.
Yeah, I have a little trouble here with fire. So first of all, I would like to thank to the organizers of this conference for organizing this great conference and inviting us to and giving us an opportunity to present our papers. And
We
cannot hear you.
it's not all.
Let's just keep very close to you.
And the speech, it's mutual. Is it working now? Okay. So again, I would like to thank the organizers for giving us opportunity to present our papers in this great conference, and also I would like to thank the audience for preferring our session to the session that runs parallelly. Alright, so when we examine the changes that took place in the social relations between Jews and non-Jews before and during the Holocaust, we never find a simple pattern. Throughout Europe, the processes of anti-Semitic discrimination and persecution reflected a wide range of attitudes and behaviors by various social groups and individuals towards the Jews. Many actively participated in depriving the Jews of their rights and property. Some expressed their solidarity with the Jews, and others chose to keep distance from what was happening. But at least from one point of view, the situation was less complicated in what was called Trianon Hungary, or the mother country. That is, in the territory marked by Hungary's post-World War I borders. Trianon Hungary was ethnically largely homogeneous. Ethnic Hungarians made up the majority of the population, and besides ethnic Germans, it was the Jews who constituted the largest religious or ethnic minority group. The Jews in Hungary were proverbially deeply assimilated, yet they became the main targets of Hungary's interwar and wartime policies of ethnic discrimination. We can say with no coarse oversimplification that in the mother country, the main victims of ethnic persecution were Jewish Hungarians, while those who could be referred to with a very rough category of bystanders were mostly non-Jewish, or as they typically put it at the time, Christian Hungarians. If we look beyond the Trianon borders, we find a different social situation. Borderlands that Hungary lost after World War I and partially regained later with Axis support were multi-ethnic to a significant degree. Besides the Jews, members of various non-Hungarian ethnic groups living in these borderlands also became subject to Hungary's nationalistic ethnic policies, which were aimed at restoring the Hungarian character of these regions. In these ethnically diverse societies, the social relations between Jews and non-Jews the range of social actors involved as victims of persecution and discrimination, persecutors, beneficiaries, spectators and helpers, and their experiences, attitudes, and behaviors were often more complex than what was typical in the mother country. The population of Hungary's re-annexed borderlands were divided by several real and arbitrary categories of race, ethnicity, nationality, and national loyalty. These categories were sometimes fluid, and they challenged the racist and nationalistic concepts and norms that had originally been established in the mother country and contrasted mainly Jews with Christians, practically meaning Hungarian Jews and Hungarian Christians. In Hungary's re-annexed borderlands, non-Hungarian Christians often found themselves in the same position as Jews, labeled as national enemies by Christian Hungarians. Not all, but definitely most Jews living in these borderlands had Hungarian national and cultural identity. Jews of Hungarian sentiments occasionally received gestures of solidarity from ethnic Hungarians who sought to create a united front against those ethnic groups they perceived as anti-Hungarian. Some non-Hungarian Christians sympathized with the Jews on the basis of sharing similar faiths. Others, however, exploited their status as Christians and joined non-Jewish Hungarians in their campaign against Jews. Social attitudes and actions by members of various ethnic groups were strongly influenced by the interwar experiences they had had with one another, by how Hungary's wartime ethnic policies treated them, and specifically by what benefits Hungary's ongoing official politics of anti-Semitism offered them. In my presentation, I focus on those parts of Vojvodina which, from April 1941 to the end of the war, were restored to Hungary. In the southern triangle, so to say, or as this region is often referred to, the southern province, and this is the term I'm going to use to avoid confusion with the geographical names. Its requisition was Hungary's last and most turbulent territorial expansion. Unlike the country's earlier border revisions, the southern province was not re-annexed by a political agreement. It was rather occupied by military force at the expense of Yugoslavia. By undertaking this occupation, Hungary practically became a belligerent on the side of Nazi Germany. The southern province had a population that was extremely mixed ethnically. The newly ensconced Hungarian authorities directed most of their attention on the Hungarians, the South Slavs, the Germans, and the Jews living in this region. The social atmosphere was pervaded by grave tensions, and society itself was strongly divided by ethnicity. Hungarians were not a majority, but many were their resentments. They were overwhelmed by the bitter experiences they had had as a repressed ethnic minority group in interwar Yugoslavia. Now they were thirsty for restitution and revenge, mostly at the expense of Serbs and Jews. The South Slavs, especially the Serbs, and more especially but not only those Serbs who settled there after World War I, as a result of the interwar Yugoslav state's policy of ethnic homogenization, were now deemed accountable for the past grievances of ethnic Hungarians and were designated for harsh treatment, mass expulsion, and deprivation of status and property. Jews, though most of them were Hungarian by language and culture, were summarily labeled as traitors who had turned their backs on ethnic Hungarians during the hardships of the interwar years. This stigma aggravated the situation of the southern province Jews, who were already hit hard-hit by being subjected immediately to Hungary's existing anti-Jewish laws, or Jewish laws. Germans in the southern province were generally discontent with the fact that Hungary and not Nazi Germany had taken control of the region. Some of them, especially members of those generations who were socialized in the old kingdom of Hungary, were willing to accept the re-establishment of Hungarian authority. But the committed pro-Nazi Germans, most of them members of the younger generations, regarded the Hungarian rule as degrading and considered it temporary. They often behaved provocatively as a state in the state, and conflicts were frequent between the local Germans and the Hungarian authorities and members of the Hungarian population. The Hungarian authorities took measures to prevent disloyal Germans from expanding their social and economic power in the region, but they did so only to the extent that their measures did not endanger Hungary's good relations with Nazi Germany. The phrase Hungarian-occupied Vojvodina, or southern province, immediately evokes another phrase, the cold days, a term referring to notorious massacres that took place in the southern Bačka region during January 1942, when Hungarian forces, claiming to be hunting for partisans, killed more than 3,000 civilians, mostly Serbs and Jews. The storm these events stirred up in internal and foreign politics prompted Hungary's new Prime Minister Miklos Kálai to introduce a policy of reconciliation towards the Serbs. They remained second-class citizens, but their situation improved subsequently. Relative to his predecessors, Kálai's Jewish policy was also more moderate, but anti-Semitic discrimination continued, and in the case of the southern province, this also meant that it was the Jews who now became the main victims of Hungary's nationalistic and racist policies. In the following part of my presentation, I'm going to discuss the many facets of bystander attitudes and activities that evolved in this region's complex social milieu during the period that lasted from the reannexation of the region by Hungary until the German occupation of the country. My focus will be on the ethnic dimensions of the various forms of anti-Semitic behavior and instances of social solidarity common people expressed towards the Jews. Manifestation of social exclusion and hatred, including public humiliation and denunciations of Jews, physical assaults on Jews, vandalism and plunder, carried out by individuals driven by anti-Semitism, vindictiveness or greed, were part of the everyday Jewish experience in the reannexed southern province. These incidents followed the rather distinct ethnic pattern. Most perpetrators were Hungarians or German. As for the Hungarians, maybe their strong involvement in anti-Semitic actions was self-explanatory. Anti-Semitism had gained ground among southern province Hungarians even before the occupation. Anti-Jewish sentiments that had been kept within certain limits during the interwar years broke loose after the transfer of state authority. Ethnic Hungarians gained a privileged position. They gained back, so to say, their self-confidence. They felt that the table had turned and the payback time had come, and many considered taking revenge on the Jews as a kind of justice for the support, as many like to claim, Jews had given to the Serb oppressors of Hungarians. The Hungarian authorities launched an ethnic-based redistribution of political, economic, and social assets, resources, and positions. The prime beneficiaries of this redistribution were to be ethnic Hungarians. Thus, it was mostly the Hungarians whose anti-Semitic actions were also motivated by the fact that through these actions, they expected to at last gain advantages and benefits they felt they deserved. In the recollections of Holocaust survivors from the southern province, it was mostly Hungarians who demonstratively ostracized, ridiculed, and humiliated the Jews. It was also mostly Hungarians who now regarded the properties of Jews as a fair game for predation. Many of them did not even wait for the shops, lands, and other possessions of the Jews to be officially expropriated and reallocated by the authorities according to the anti-Jewish laws. They set out to plunder the Jews arbitrarily. Especially during the first few months of the occupation, when the general conditions in the region were rather unconsolidated, Jews were often simply robbed. During these times, when southern province Jews feared that they, just like many of their fellows, would be arrested, interned, or even expelled, it was not difficult to extort even significant sums of money from the victims by blackmail and threats. Others used deception to extort money from Jews, claiming that by bribing their influential connections, they could help free relatives of the Jews from internment camps. During and following the cold days, Novi Sad and its environs became scene of the kind of shameless robbery of Jewish properties that only began in the rest of the country during the spring and summer of 1944, after mass deportations in rural Hungary had started. Most of those persons who plundered the unattended houses and shops of Jews who went missing during the raids were Hungarians. Maybe it was not surprising that many Hungarians in the reannexed southern province believed that they were given a green light to blackmail and plunder the Jews. It was the local Hungarian authorities who set an example with their own actions. What the population saw was that the military authorities who controlled the region in the first few months of the occupation, regularly extorted huge amounts of money from local Jewish communities. Some of the civilian authorities also maintained this routine. Official propaganda proclaimed that the Jews were enemies of the nation and that their properties were to become compensation for Hungarians. One worker, as an example, who was caught plundering Jewish shops, reportedly said that he thought what he did was not a crime but an act of patriotism, and that the authorities would turn a blind eye to it. While he was wrong in this, especially after Hungary's direct military control over the southern province ended, restoration of civil law and order in the region became a priority. As a result, the authorities did not tolerate arbitrary anti-Semitic excesses by the civilian population. Criminal investigations were launched against the perpetrators, and depending on the severity of their crimes, they could even be imprisoned for years. After the consolidation of the civil administration over the region, and especially during the time of the Kale government, the authorities in the southern province tried to keep anti-Semitic discrimination more or less within the framework set by the official Hungarian anti-Jewish laws. Paradoxically, this provided the Jews a certain degree of legal protection, at least from the arbitrary assaults by members of the civilian population. A few Hungarians, as in the example you can see, were even punished for simply verbally insulting Jews. Similar verdicts were rare even in the mother country. I want to emphasize that the authorities in the southern province were not so much concerned with protecting the Jews, but in shoring up legal order itself. But Jews could also sometimes benefit from efforts by authorities to keep the conditions in the region under their control. It was mostly Hungarians who denounced the Jews for alleged economic crimes, anti-national activities, and other offenses. In a number of cases, the denunciators did indeed succeed in goading the authorities to deprive the Jews of their businesses, or in worst case, intern them. However, the authorities themselves had to establish that many denunciations were motivated purely by malice and personal vengeance. Jews were no doubt chief targets of popular hostility, but the reason hostility against Jews often grew exceptionally strong was because exceptionally strong was the hostility that dominated the public atmosphere in general. The new Hungarian authorities of the re-annexed southern province were more or less prepared for an upwelling of popular animosities of various kinds and for a rush of denunciations. Perhaps they did not expect the outburst to be so strong. As in the slide, you can read it, the deputy chief of the Hungarian police noted in one of his memorandum that the whole country was pervaded by an atmosphere of intense hatred, regardless of ethnicity, and most people tried to settle their personal conflicts by reporting them to the authorities. Many Hungarians who denounced the Jews probably did indeed believe that the Jews were enemies of the Hungarian people and that taking actions against Jews was a patriotic duty. Some simply wanted to get rid of their Jewish business rivals and obtain Jewish property. Others were disappointed to see the process of the official anti-Semitic Aryanization proceeding more slowly than what they wished, and suspected that behind the scene, anti-Jewish machinations by Jews were responsible for this. Anti-Jewish voices were probably further amplified due to another factor. The southern province, Hungarians often felt that Hungary, which was ever more overwhelmed with its wartime difficulties, did not welcome their homecoming as enthusiastically as it had welcomed home the Hungarians of the territories that had been re-annexed earlier. The frustration and desire for self-empowerment deriving from this sense of being a neglected child could also sometimes be channelized into anti-Semitic aggression. It was probably not a coincidence that the narrative among southern province Hungarians that they were the last to return to the country, but first in understanding the Jewish question, was so powerful. Eventually, of course, they were by all means not the only ones in the country who claimed themselves the first place in this regard. As for the Germans in the southern province, in some villages, as you can see in the example below, with the German majority, the situation of the Jews simply became untenable. Ferenc Klein, for instance, explained that the reason why he moved away from Novi Verbas was because he could no longer handle the threatening behavior of the German villagers. It is conspicuous that most perpetrators of anti-Semitic vandalism, such as attacks against synagogues, smashing Jews' windows, were Germans rather than Hungarians. The most attacks of this kind were committed by juveniles, it was not just youngsters performing excessive pranks. Rather, these actions reflected the aggressive anti-Semitism that prevailed among the German population. This phenomenon could also be explained by the provocative and dismissive attitude radical Germans generally maintained toward the Hungarian state and social system. The Hungarian state's official program of anti-Semitism launched the deprivation of Jews of their rights, their pauperization, and social exclusion. Physical aggression against Jews occurred, but in a general sense, and for a time, it was not an inherent part of this program. In order to secure law and order, anti-Jewish violence was especially not tolerated by authorities when it was committed by common people. Opinion leaders in the southern province also emphasized that, I quote, "The final showdown with the Jews is the government's task and nobody has the right to solve this issue arbitrarily." Thus, while many Hungarians in the southern province believed that taking away or even stealing property from the Jews was not a crime, but they could also see and were probably more likely to respect that the authorities oppose arbitrary anti-Semitic violence, whereas many radical Germans maintained that no such directives, or for that matter, no directives of any kind by Hungarian authorities apply to them. Aggression by radical Germans towards Hungarians and even moderate Germans was common, but Jews were the most defenseless victims in this regard. Contemporary sources and testimonies of Holocaust survivors rarely mention cases in which Serbs in the southern province tried to take advantage of the situation of the persecuted Jews. Already before the re-annexation, the anti-Semitism by Serbs strong enough to be determinative of the everyday experiences of the Jews did not exist in the region. After the re-annexation, Serbs themselves became victims of persecution. Thus, it was also due to their own insecure situation that Serbs did not feel an urge to join the campaign that Hungarian authorities and the privileged ethnic groups of the population launched against Jews. On the other hand, this was not entirely self-evident. During the Kale government, as I mentioned, the situation of the Serbs, at least in comparison to their previous status, improved. Hungarian authorities in the southern province were willing to reward members of ethnic minorities who were loyal to Hungarians and, to a certain extent, share with them the resources that were being redistributed through the process of anti-Semitic Aryanization. Of course, there could be, and indeed there were, some Serbs who mistreated the Jews, either from anti-Semitism or from a desire to stabilize their own situation and demonstrate their loyalties towards Hungarians, or from a hope of gaining social and economic benefits. These cases, however, were rather sporadic. The focus of an analysis of social relations between Jews and non-Jews in the southern province, of course, cannot be limited to examples of animosity and hatred. As regards the cases of sympathy and solidarity towards Jews, these cases did not follow a clear, ethnically colored pattern. Regardless of ethnicity, maybe it's not a surprise, it was mostly personal acquaintances, colleagues and friends whom Jews could count on in hard times. The significance of the support network of Jews was especially strong as regards the Christian Hungarians involved. Many of the new Hungarian authorities of the regions were not from the southern province, but from the mother country. So especially at the beginning, they did not have a profound knowledge of local and personal matters. Thus, in these matters, they heavily relied on the opinion of local, reliable Hungarians. Under these circumstances, southern province Jews were much more dependent on their network of Christian Hungarians than were the Jews in the mother country. Naturally, the influence southern province Hungarians had in this regard could be, and indeed was, often used to compromise Jews before the authorities. But they were also benevolent people who used their status as reliable Hungarians, sometimes with success, on behalf of their Jewish friends, help them prove their national loyalty before the authorities and keep their businesses or gain release from an internment camps. Many Serbs who sympathized with the Jews clearly did so because they felt they were sharing a common fate. They saw the anti-Semitic atrocities as manifestations of the inhumanity of the same nationalistic Hungarian state they also viewed with distress and often with hostility and fear. This was reflected, for instance, and is in the example below, in the gesture of compassion by a Serbian peasant toward Ferenc Ofner, while he, together with other local Jews, was working as a forced laborer in Novi Sad and its environs. Seeing the brutality of the Hungarian guards, the peasant encouraged the forced laborers, and obviously himself too, by saying that these dark days would not last forever and that the time of justice would come. Gestures of human decency sometimes came from local Germans too. Zoltán Bíró, for instance, from Subotica, said he and his companions in the forced labor group were lucky to have been stationed at the house of a German in Pigravica who treated them very humanly. Bíró also noted, however, that kind treatment of Jews by Germans was not common. Regardless of their ethnicity, persons who were deemed to have been too friendly with Jews found themselves in trouble. They easily became targets of popular condemnation. In the worst cases, they were denounced to the authorities. At the same time, one's ethnicity and one's position in the new Hungarian power structure defined by ethnicity and race could restrict or expand one's ability and possibilities to do something to help Jews. In this regard, the situation of the Serbs was the most constrained. Members of privileged ethnic groups, especially Hungarians and Germans, found themselves with a little more leeway. It was mostly Hungarians and a smaller number of Germans who endeavored to break laws and risk criminal prosecution in order to cooperate with the Jews. So were, for instance, Hungarians and Germans most strawmans, that is, those persons who took over Jewish-owned businesses under the pro forma contracts to enable their real Jewish owners to circumvent the anti-Jewish laws and continue their business activities. It was also chiefly Hungarians and Germans who helped Jews to flee from neighboring Nazi-controlled Serbian territories and on the Polish independent state of Croatia, where implementation of the final solution started soon after the dismantling of Yugoslavia, the Hungarian-controlled southern province, which was for a time considered safer for the Jews. Clearly, it was the Hungarians and Germans who were under the least strict official supervision and who felt themselves safe enough to undertake risky endeavors on the Jews' behalf. And one last sentence. At the same time, these cases can only be, with caution, be regarded as acts of help provided to Jews. A number of strawmans and so-called Jew smugglers did assist the Jews selflessly. Most strawmans, though, sought for profit, even if this profit was mutual, since otherwise their Jewish partners might not have been able to earn a living. Some Jew smugglers also acted out of sympathy, as this example shows, but most of them were driven only by greed. And even if they did save Jews from being murdered soon by the Nazis or their Serbian and Croatian accomplices, of course many of these Jews were later deported from Hungary and killed anyway, they often took advantage of the plight of the refugees and made the people they had saved victims of their own acts of blackmail and plunder. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think it's not only interesting but a very pioneering project. I don't know if there is any previous research about the very complex relations of these different ethnic groups in this area. Since the topics in our session are very different, I suggest to devote a very few minutes to each one of them for questions or short discussion. So in case some of you have questions, but please now. Otherwise it would be very diverse. So only please very short questions, yes.
I think that it should be noted that part of the Hungarian persecution of Jews was also other.
You can come here if you want.
Thank you. My question is, and it's also a lot, but I would like to know if you think, as I think, that part of the Hungarian persecution of Jews, it was over-exaggerated, of course. It was based also on the fact that there were quite a few Jewish Hungarian communist sympathizers who were also against the Hungarian annexation. For example, in November 41, as a result of sabotage acts by communists in Bachka, there was a very big trial where 11 or 12 people were executed. among them there were many Jews. Most of them were Jews. Part of them are even commemorated in Subotica today with name streets. So I think it's part of the characteristic of the persecution of the Jews by Hungarians, being Hungarian Jews, part of them sympathizer of communist and partisan movement there.
Any other questions? So maybe a short question of mine, if it's possible. We spoke mostly about the Jews as the victims of persecution and the relations of the Jews with other groups. I would like to ask if you can say a little about the way the local Jews reacted initially to the Hungarian annexation. Did they see it as coming home, or did they see it as a hostile occupation? And about maybe a little about the relations between the Jews in this area and the Hungarian Jews in the Trianonic borders.
All right, as for the first question about like broadly about the involvement of Jews into the communist resistance, so to say, in the southern provinces, is a very interesting topic, and it maybe this was my biggest dilemma about my research. This is my doctoral research I was presently part of. Because of course I'm dealing with the Jewish reactions, Jewish voices, coping strategies, resistance. And it was a big dilemma to me whether to include the communist resistance as such to the chapter of the Jewish resistance, because I don't want to get deep into this, but there is a big debate in the literature whether, well, communist resistance should be regarded as a form of Jewish resistance or not. There are arguments and counter-arguments. It's a long story, but like Mani says that like a lot of communist Jews, they were secular, they did not have a self-image or identification as Jews. And this is why initially I was thinking about just omitting the chapter of the communist resistance from the chapter of the Jewish resistance. But after I started to get more into especially the testimonies, oral history interviews of Holocaust survivors, I changed my mind, because it was a particular situation in the southern province. You have to know that after taking over the region, the Hungarian authorities were very harsh on breaking down all possible forms of resistance, and practically the only organized resistance was the communist resistance that remained. They were not many and not too well organized, but it did exist, and there were a lot of investigations, prosecutions, death sentences, and so on and so forth against members of the communist resistance, and indeed there were a lot of Jews among them. Now, the conclusion I drew that in the case of the southern province, it was a form of the Jewish resistance, because most Jews who participated in the communist resistance were Jews who were in the interwar period active in Zionism and leftist Zionist movement. We heard in the opening lectures and before that how Zionism was not strong in Hungary at all. But in the interwar period, in Yugoslavia, Zionism was very strong. It also has its explanation. It's also related to this, well, it's orientation and identification crisis, this Hungarian, the Jews of Hungarian culture had, and like what to do after change of authority, etc., etc. So to put a long story short, is that many Jews who were active in leftist Zionist movements after the occupation of the southern province by Hungarians, they saw it as an only form to engage in active resistance to join communists. And many Jews, many Holocaust survivors I listened to interviews with, they emphasized that even they had nothing to do with the communists, they were Zionists, or not even Zionists, but they wanted to engage in an active resistance. They had no other choice but the communist, to join the communist resistance. So in this particular case, I would say that it's a part. So as for the identity, what was the question? Yeah, the identity. Yeah, we have to. It's a commonplace. I also mentioned that most Hungarians, most Jews in the southern province, were Hungarians by culture and language. Not all of them. It is too bad that Attila Paine did not come, because he would have talked about this very same topic on the interwar period. But in any case, it was a more complex situation, and especially younger like members of the younger generations tend to become, to a certain degree, Yugoslavs. And after the regime change, the old generations did maintain their Hungarian identity. They welcomed the Hungarian troops. Of course, they had great disappointment by how the Hungarian authorities treated them. And those Jews who tend to, well, adopt a sort of Yugoslav identity, they obviously they looked back to the Yugoslav era as a sort of paradise compared to the present hell, even though, well, it's also true. So I can see a distinction between the older generations and the new generation. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. As I said, it's really a pioneer research, and I look forward to hear more about your research in the future. Our next speaker is Dr. Levi Cooper, originally from Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Cooper completed his doctorate in the Faculty of Law at Bahrain University. Currently, he is a postdoctoral fellow with the Inter-University Academic Partnership of Russia and Eastern European Studies. His research interests include legal history of the late modern period, law and literature, and interplays between Jewish legal writing and the broader legal, intellectual, and cultural context. Dr. Cooper, please.
Good afternoon. It's possible to have been born in Austria-Hungary, have been married in Czechoslovakia, have given birth in Hungary, have lived your life with your family in the Soviet Union, reside currently in Ukraine, and have never left the city of Mukachevo. This sign, describing the 20th century vicissitudes of one town in Subcarpathian Rus, used to hang on the wall of the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation. Yet even before the 20th century, Jewish communities of Subcarpathian Rus were embedded in an environment of shifting borders and changing political realities. Subcarpathian Rus lies to the north of the Hungarian plain and continues northward until the Carpathian Mountains form a natural border. Munkac lies below the Carpathians. Today, the region in Ukraine is bordered by Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Geographically situated at the perimeter of empires, Subcarpathian Rus can be considered a borderland over time, in the sense that changing regimes resulted in varying cultural influences, while the political border was a constituent part of life. The term borderland usually refers to a loosely defined region that is significantly affected by a border. I'm suggesting that Subcarpathian Rus can be considered a borderland because it was at the periphery of empires, kingdoms, or states. From a Jewish perspective, the region served as a catchment area for different ideas, specifically Hungarian Orthodoxy and Hasidism from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and two of its successor states, Congress Poland and Galicia. This resulted in overlapping social and cultural networks. As communities developed in the second half of the 18th century, the need for rabbinic leaders emerged. Alas, homegrown rabbis were not available. Given that Jews were a non-state, trans-border people, the notion of filling leadership positions by looking beyond political borders was natural. Yet the need to import rabbinic leadership necessitated a decision from where should rabbis be recruited. This question was loaded with significance, for the rabbi was often a product of his breeding ground. Thus, the question was not so much a geographic inquiry as it was a question of identity, ideology, and affiliation. Whose influence should we import? The answer to this question was not necessarily a conscious decision. It's likely that the answer, at least in part, was a product of natural affiliations and connections, meaning that rabbis were imported from recognized and comfortable sources. Hence, imported rabbis may provide a window into the Jewish community. Today, I will focus on the rabbinate of one Jewish community in Sub-Carpathian Rus. I will trace the epistolary networks, the letters of Munkach rabbis, and garner what we know about their origins and their activity. My presentation will span the period from the earliest recorded rabbis through to 1893, when the Munkach rabbinate took on a dynastic character. Thus, the three Munkach rabbis who served during the first half of the 20th century and are so controversial, and the heirs to the Munkach legacy today, lie beyond the scope of my presentation. Jews reached Munkach from the middle of the 17th century, apparently after fleeing the Cossack uprising in 1648. It would take a full century of settlement before documents reveal that there was a proper Jewish community in Munkach. The first Beit Knesset, the first synagogue, was built in 1741. Following the first partition of Poland in 1772, southeast Poland was annexed to the Austrian Empire and renamed Galicia. This political development changed the border between southeast Poland and Hungarian Carpathok from a border between countries to a border between provinces within the Habsburg Empire. The Jews of Sub-Carpathian Rus were generally poor and traditional and geographically remote from other Jewish centers. Local rabbinic leadership, therefore, played a key role in Jewish life. Even though Munkach was part of Hungary, the community did not look towards the Jewish communities in the southwest to fill rabbinic posts. The political reality, together with the geographic proximity, made recruitment from Poland a viable prospect. Rabbi Yehuda Leib is the first recorded rabbi of Munkach, though we know almost nothing about him. We only know about him because he is mentioned in a responsum, Shelot Utshuvot, penned in 1784 by Rabbi Yitzchak Abraham Katz. Katz was serving as rabbi of Stopnica in Galicia at the time, and he recorded the following tale. A man visiting Munkach fell gravely ill, and Yehuda Leib sent his beadle, his gabbai, and another person to the sick man's deathbed in order to record the man's name, the name of his father, and the name of his town. The Munkach rabbinate intended to notify the wife of her husband's death, thereby allowing her to remarry and making sure she was not an aguna. The messengers collected the names, but one significant detail was unclear: the wife's name. The beadle thought he heard the man say, Rachel, but he couldn't be certain. These were the man's final words, and under the circumstances, the beadle's composure was ruffled. Moreover, the beadle had been intent on remembering the other details, so it was entirely possible that he was mistaken with regards to the wife's name. The other messenger could not recall whether or not they'd even asked the man for his wife's name. The woman who claimed to be the wife of the deceased went by the name Chana, not Rachel. And she wanted to now get remarried based on the testimony of the Munkach rabbinate. When she passed through Stopnitsa, she showed the affidavit to Katz and she asked him to rule that she could remarry. Katz was reticent about ruling on the matter. The Munkach testimony was problematic and Katz was unable to verify the signatures on the document. Chana's plight moved Katz to address the issue, and in a lengthy responsum, he ruled that she could remarry. The ruling was supported by another two rabbis, the rabbi of Chenchin and the rabbi of Pinchov. The exchange suggests a link between Munkach and Poland, but it also reflects the distance between Munkach on one side of the Carpathian Mountains and Stopnitsa, Chenchin and Pinchov on the other side. On one hand, a traveller from Poland died in Munkach, and the wife brought the document to a court in Galicia. On the other hand, Katz and his colleagues were unable to verify the Munkach document because it had been written over 300 kilometers away over a mountain range. The next recorded rabbi of Munkach was Rabbi Avraham Gottesman. Gottesman corresponded on two legal matters with Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, rabbi in Prague and one of the leading jurists in the 18th century. The case involved a Polish Jew who had moved to Munkach sometime in the 1760s, and upon his death there were questions about levirate marriage, yibum v'chalitza, that Gottesman faced. The complex scenario is beyond the scope of my presentation today, though once again it shows us a connection between Munkach in Hungary and Poland. Gottesman chose to send his legal correspondence westward rather than discuss the issue with jurists in Poland. Given Landau's towering stature, this is unsurprising. 3 years later, in 1794, after Landau had died, Gottesman sent a legal question to Rabbi Yirmiyah Rosenbaum, a rabbi in northeastern Hungary. The question involved a woman who admitted to Gottesman that she committed adultery. The confession occurred while her husband was in Poland. A few days later, the woman denied her confession. She said, "I never made such a confession." And subsequently, she left Munkach to go to Poland to be with her husband. When Gottesman visited Poland, he met the husband and he told the husband about his wife's confession. The husband confirmed that his wife had also told him about her infidelity, and he believed her. The couple was planning to return to Munkach, hence Gottesman was considering the legal validity of her confessions. Gottesman asked Rosenbaum to forward the question to his son, Yoav Rosenbaum, who was serving as rabbi in northwestern Hungary. Both father and son obliged with detailed responsa, and all 3 letters were published in 1798 in this work, Moda'ah V'Ones. Lest we think that the discussion was solely of Hungarian interest, this volume carried a letter of Haskama, an approbation, from Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Rosanus of Lemberg in Galicia, who specifically mentioned Gottesman and the exchange with the 2 Rosenbaums. One more document has survived from Gottesman's pen. In 1800, Gottesman wrote an approbation for the Shulchan Aruch, printed in Vienna. The Christian publisher of that edition of the Shulchan Aruch had also printed an edition of the Talmud that included approbations from Gottesman's 3 correspondents, Landau, Yirmiyah Rosenbaum, and Yoav Rosenbaum, as well as from Galician Rosanus, suggesting a further link between these rabbis. This web of connections demonstrates how, despite the geographic isolation of Munkach, Gottesman was part of a rabbinic network in the Austrian Empire that linked Hungary, Galicia, and the capital, Vienna. The third recorded rabbi of Munkach was Rabbi Tzvi Avigdor Ashkenazi. also from Galicia. Tzvi Avigdor's grandfather had served in Galician rabbinates, and he had written a commentary on 2 tractates of Talmud. The second volume included notes from Tzvi Avigdor, who is identified as the rabbi of Munkach, although his name is mistaken on the title page. During Tzvi Avigdor's tenure, Munkach came under the influence of the famed rabbinic figure who inspired Hungarian orthodoxy, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, as Tzvi Avigdor corresponded with Sofer on practical and theoretical legal matters. Tzvi Avigdor's origins, coupled with his extensive correspondence with the Khatam Sofer, reinforces the image of Munkach as a meeting point between Galician tradition and Hungarian orthodoxy. After Tzvi Avigdor Ashkenazi died, the Munkach community once again appointed a Galician rabbi, Rabbi Tzvi Elimelech Shapira. Tzvi Elimelech's tenure in Munkach was short-lived, but left a lasting impact. While in Munkach, he reformed the Jewish education system with the goal of socializing students and preserving Jewish traditional life. To this end, he enacted Takanot Tamchin D'Oraita, regulations for the support of Torah. And this legislation was later copied and reprinted and promulgated in Kolomaya, Lemberg, and Horodenka, all in Galicia. When Tzvi Elimelech crossed the Carpathian Mountains, he used radiant terms to describe Munkach, calling it a joyful habitat, Kiryah Aliza, a biblical phrase that refers to Yerushalayim. But sometime later, Tzvi Elimelech's glowing praise turned to damnation as the rabbi became embroiled in fights. Community tensions culminated in Tzvi Elimelech's departure from Munkach and returned to Galicia in 1828. 5 years later, Rabbi Azriel Gruen was appointed rabbi of Munkach, having served in the rabbinate in 2 Galician towns. Gruen is credited with introducing Nusach Sfarad, the Hasidic prayer rite, into the main synagogue in Munkach. A collection of Gruen's teachings that was first published on the eve of the Second World War offers further evidence of his Hasidic affiliation. Gruen is described as a disciple of the Chozeh of Lublin, and he cites Rabbi Shalom of Belz as his teacher. Gruen died in 1841, and he was replaced by another Galician rabbi, Rabbi Ephraim Fischl Horowitz, who came from a famous Galician Hasidic family and corresponded on legal matters with authorities in Galicia. Thus, for the first century of the Munkach rabbinate on record, those who filled the post of rabbi hailed from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and its successors, or at least they maintained professional connections with their peers on the other side of the Carpathian Mountains. As the Hasidic movement gained currency in Galicia and Congress Poland, Hasidic influences penetrated Munkach, even though formally it was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. But this was about to change. Following Horowitz's death in 1860, a new rabbi was not appointed immediately. Instead, the rabbinic court took responsibility for communal matters. It was during this time that Munkach looked westward to the Khatam Sofer's school rather than towards Hasidic Galicia. For the first time, the office of the rabbi of Munkach was filled by a native of Pressburg, Rabbi Chaim Sofer, who had already served in the rabbinate in a number of Hungarian towns. For Munkach residents, Sofer's appeal may have been his zealous defense of Jewish traditional customs and against any hint of reforms. In 1865, he was one of the driving forces behind a rabbinic gathering in Nadi Mihali that turned out to be a crucial moment in the crystallization of Hungarian orthodoxy. Sofer's Munkach tenure came to an end amidst communal infighting amongst the Orthodox. Sofer then took a rabbinic post in more familiar territory, the newly found independent Orthodox rabbinate in Pest. With the departure of Sofa, Munkac once again turned to Galicia, inviting Rabbi Shlomo Shapira to assume the rabbinate. Shlomo arrived in Munkac with his extended family, including his son and his young grandson, who would both go on to inherit the Munkac rabbinate. Shlomo was an ideal candidate for the position. On the sentimental front, he was the grandson of Tzvi Elimelech Shapira, by this point a legendary Hasidic figure. Shlomo was also qualified for the position, having served in the rabbinate of Tarnograd in Congress, Poland, and then Stryjov in Galicia. Shlomo wrote responsa and other legal treatises and homiletic works, yet he avoided the printing press. And in his will, he explicitly instructed that his writings were not to be published, saying that he had not merited to finish even one of his works. His son and grandson understood Shlomo's injunction to be applied to publishing the works in their entirety. There was no reason that they could not publish select portions of his writings. Thus, Shlomo's son and grandson published long citations from their grandfather's works. In this manner, a medley of Shlomo's writings have survived. Analysing the approbations that Shlomo penned, the Haskamot, suggests that his influence is primarily local. Of the 9 approbations that have survived, most of the works printed in the local printing press, but the approbations do not tell the full story. Soon after arriving in Munkac, Shlomo was one of 24 rabbis from Hungary who signed a proclamation condemning an aid to Talmud study entitled Hamadrich al Bamotei Yam HaTalmud. Hamadrich precipitated a significant debate that involved rabbis from Galicia, from Lithuania, from Hungary, from Bohemia, from Germany, from France, from Italy, from England, from Turkey, from Jerusalem, just not from Australia. Hungarian rabbis denounced the publication for its modernist tendencies and because the affiliations of the authors, who were rabbis in their own right, but they belonged to the status quo faction. In the present context, Shlomo's signature on this letter indicates his affiliation with the Orthodox faction in Hungary soon after he arrived in Munkac. Most of Shlomo's legal communications that have survived do not include the identity of his correspondents. But the picture from those that I have managed to work out with who he's corresponding, we have a picture of Shlomo corresponding not with Galicia, but corresponding with Hungarian rabbis. This is particularly funny because Shlomo wrote in one of his responsa, "I'm not Hungarian, I'm Galician." So even though he identified as a Galician, even though he came from Galicia, his eyes were directed towards Hungary.
This was the same direction.
The networks of Munkac rabbis from the second half of the 18th century until the end of the 19th century demonstrate how Sub-Carpathian Rus acted as a borderland. The fact that Munkac was politically part of Hungary did not preclude the possibility of Galician and Polish impact on ideologies, practices, and legal exchanges. In fact, for most of its history, the Munkac rabbinate was closer in ethos to Poland, demonstrating that political borders were not as influential as cultural affiliations. Notwithstanding, the region should be seen as an integrated borderland where influences from both centres were palpable. Hungarian Orthodoxy from Oberland and Hasidism from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and its successors. For most of the history of the Munkac rabbinate, the winds seem to blow from only one direction at any particular time. During the 20th century, the period I have not had the opportunity to discuss today, the Munkac rabbinate saw these influences reach a confluence in the persona of the rabbis who served the community. Having detailed the Munkacs rabbinate, beginning with the earliest records, we have a window into this borderland region between Poland and Hungary. Hasidism arrived from Poland, Orthodoxy arrived from Hungary. While a cultural and intellectual crossroads implies transfer of ideas, Munkacs was not a way station. Polish Hasidism did not spread from Munkacs to the rest of Hungary, and Hungarian Orthodoxy did not travel from Munkacs to Poland. Rather, Munkacs was a terminus. Let me just conclude by saying that using the word terminus is sadly ironic, given that terminus is the Roman god of boundaries, endings, and death. Terminus is also associated with the Latin motto, concedo nulli, I yield to no one, so eminently appropriate for the determined rabbis of Munkacs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. Hearing your lecture, I thought about the very well-known article of Moshe Rossman, Jewish History Beyond the Border. This is exactly what this is showing. Short questions, please.
אני כיליד מונקאץ' יכול להעיר שבארבעת הכרכים של חכמי גליציה מנויים רבני מונקאץ'. רבני מונקאץ' היו מיוחדים, אבל כשהתחילה הציונות עם הרצל ב-1897, אז הרבנים ממונקאץ' היו צריכים להחליט לאן נושבת הרוח. אני רק רוצה לדבר על הרב האחרון שפגשתי אותו אישית, הרב ברוך יהושע ירחמל רבינוביץ'. הוא היה אזרח פולני, ומכיוון שהרב בעל מנחת אלעזר לא היו לו ילדים, הוא התגרש מאשתו, התחתן עם עוד אישה, והאישה הזאת ילדה לו ילדה אחת, וכשהיא התחתנה עם ברוך, עם רבינוביץ', זאת הייתה חגיגה לאומית בצ'כוסלובקיה. יש על זה סרט, ובסרט הזה יש גם כן על הגימנסיה העברית במונקאץ' שאבא שלי זכרו לברכה, יהודי היה המנהל השני. המגמה של דוקטור חיים קוגל, שבא מרוסיה ועוד היה תלמיד הרצליה, המגמה הייתה להכניס את הציונות לא בדרך האחורית אלא בדרך הישרה, ולכן היו לו כל הריבות עם רבינוביץ'. אבא שלי בא לרבינוביץ' ואמר לו, תראה, אתה רב חדש, אני מנהל חדש, אחרי קוגל. הוא אמר לו, תראה, תבוא לגימנסיה, אומר, זה אני לא יכול, תפסיקו את כל הצומות וזעקתם. הרבי ממונקאץ' אמר, בואי כל צמא לכו למים, ציוניסטים, מזרחיסטים, אגודיסטים, כולם יצטרפו בהם. איך רבי יכול להגיד את זה? שנאת ישראל העבירה אותו על דעתו. הוא פשוט היה לא נורמלי, יימח שמו וזכרו.
תודה רבה.
אני לא נכנס לדיון, שמענו את הבקשה.
אתה יודע עברית, למה אתה לא מדבר עברית?
כי המושב לא עברית.
אז מה, אני יודע גם אנגלית. עברית זה שפת הקודש, בארץ ישראל צריך לדבר עברית. עברית דבר עברית.
Some of the audience don't know Hebrew, so I can ask Hebrew, but some of the audience, they don't speak Hebrew.
Okay, please.
You don't mention in your lecture about Shlomo Zandquist from Udvar. He was a Gaon.
Any other questions or comments?
אני יודע עברית, אני רק התבקשתי לדבר.
יש עוד שאלה קטנה?
זה לא שאלה, אני רוצה להודות לך מקרב לב. אבא שלי ז"ל הוא מקרפטרוס, בחוס, אז אני מאוד מודה לך שנתת במה ליהדות האלה, ויש סיפור, הם יכלו לגור באותו מקום והחליפו 5 מדינות.
כאן פתחתי את
אני הדור השני, תנו גם כבוד לדור השני, אני לא מתגאה, נושא השואה מאוד קרוב לליבי, אני הבת הבכורה, מוצאי שבת אסור היה לדבר, מדור לחיפוש כתבים. הקדשתי את חיי לנושא השואה. אני 15 שנה לומדת ביד ושם בגבעתיים, בבית וולין. נלחמתי 10 שנים שיהיה רחוב על שם ראול ולנברג. מאוד כואב לי, אדם כזה, אני צריכה 10 שנים עם קבוצה להילחם. עכשיו עוד דבר קטן, מחר אני אביא לכם את זה. היות ואני לומדת ביד ושם, רק דקה, תעשו לי מחווה, שלחו לצלב האדום בז'נבה בקשה למסמכים של אמא שלי, גילו אותם, הגיע לשם, אז יש לי מסמכים מאושוויץ. מה כתוב שם? מקימו אותם, נגיד מוכר מכוניות, כמה עשית ביום. הם היו צריכים לדווח כמה מתים, כתוב מתי הגיע מספר 6303A אושוויץ, מתי נפטרה, מתי סיבת המוות, האם היא נשרפה או נקברה. אני לא יכולה לישון בגלל זה. ובסוף עשו קרוס גדול כי היא ניצלה. אבל אני אביא לכם מחר, תראו, ראיתם מסמך כזה? לא ראית. זה משהו. טוב, תודה רבה על תשומת הלב.
I'll respond briefly על ראשון. למר עמוס רובין, לדוקטור עמוס רובין, תודה רבה על ההערות. אני הגדרתי את...
אני לא מר, אני מתוק.
אדון...
מר מתוק, כן.
אני הגדרתי, הנושא שלי היום לא עסק במאה ה-20, ולכן לא התייחסתי כלל לרבני מונקאץ' במאה ה-20, לרבות לא רב רבינוביץ', לא רב חיים אלעזר שפירא ולא אביו שלפניו רב צבי הרש שפירא. אשמח מאוד להתייחס לדברים אלו, תצטרכו להזמין אותי עוד פעם ואדבר בעברית בפעם הבאה. רגע, to doctor who asked me about a question about Ungvar, what I presented today, you're 100% right that there were very important rabbis in other cities. הגברת הזכירה חוסט, אז גם בחוסט היו רבנים חשובים. Also in Ungvar, not just Gansfried, also there were other rabbis, Eisenstatter, Mayor Eisenstatter and his son Menachem Eisenstatter. There were a lot of important rabbis in Ungvar. Methodologically, what I tried to do today is to take one city and track its rabbinate and look at it as a micro-history that would perhaps indicate to us a larger story. But certainly Ungvar deserves to be researched on its own. כמו כן, גם חוסט, צריך לבחון את חוסט ואת הרבנים שכיהנו בחוסט, גם כן באותה מידה. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to proceed to the last lecture. I was also instructed that we don't have so much time. I want to invite my friend Dr. Atila. We met a few years ago in the conference in Budapest, a very interesting conference dealing with the diaspora experience from Jewish, Israeli, and from Hungarian perspective. Dr. Atila Gido is a historian and researcher at the Romanian Institute for Research on National Minorities. His main research areas are history of the Transylvanian Jews after World War I, the Zionist movement in Transylvania, the Holocaust in Northern Transylvania, Holocaust survivors in Transylvania, and also genealogy. Please.
My paper focuses on the 7-month period between August 13, 1940 and March 27, 1941. It has the period from the Second Vienna Award and the issuing of the decree number 2320 from 1941 that enforced the so-called Second Hungarian anti-Jewish law in northern Transylvania. As we know, the Act of 1939 on the limitation of Jewish expansion in public and economic spheres restricted the proportion of Jews to 6%. So my presentation deals with a period when only the general regulations of the Hungarian Second Anti-Jewish Law were implemented in this territory. Following the Second Vienna War in 1940, northern Transylvania became part of Hungary. With this legal change, 151,000 people of Jewish faith found themselves again under Hungarian rule. The Jewish laws that were brought into effect were based on racial categories, thus applied not only on practicing Jews, but also on Jews converted to Christianism too. Therefore, the anti-Semitic measures that were taken by the Hungarian government affected 164,000 people living in northern Transylvania, that is 6.4% of the population. The majority of the Jews were Hungarian-speaking and culturally assimilated to the Hungarian population. Many of them had either a double Hungarian Jewish identity or an ethnic Jewish identity. Commerce, industry, and the liberal professions provided the means of living for the majority of Jews. The proportion in some liberal professions was exceptionally high. For instance, according to data from 1941, the proportion of the Jewish doctors was more than 44% among the northern Transylvanian physicians. And the similar situation was in the case of lawyers. Before turning to the period after the Second Vienna War, it is worth comparing the legal status of the northern Transylvanian Jews to Hungary and to the general situation in Central Europe.
Excuse me? Please look on the transparent on the right side of Jews, Israelites and Jews, and 48,000. There is some mistake.
Yeah, it's not a mistake. I will explain you. Jews it means ethnic Jews according to the censuses. In 1930 and 1941, the people of Transylvania were asked on their ethnicity, language skills, religion. In 1941, 48,000 Jews declared themselves ethnic Jews, but there were 151,000 people who declared themselves Israelites, whose religion was Israelite. But according to the racial laws, considered more than 164,000 people Jews. So this is why we have three different
categories. Just the indentation shows that the Israelites and the Jews, according to the racial laws, are included in the 48,000. And that's misleading.
Okay, and we don't have time. Sorry, we don't have time.
Okay, I think that I explained right here. So I think that I will switch the comparison of the Romanian and Hungarian legal status of the Jews. So I continue with the military and civil administration period. The Hungarian army occupied the northern Transylvanian territories until September 13, 1940, and there was immediately introduced the military administration, which lasted until November 26, 1940. Waves of South Transylvania refugees were arriving to the northern territories, among them many Jews. The National Central Authority for Controlling Aliens, KEOK in Hungarian, reported in January 1941 that in 3 transition camps in Kolozsvár, Szászfenes, and Szamosfalva were more than 20,000 refugees altogether. 633, just 3.1% of them were Jews. The first measures taken by the Hungarian military administration quickly disillusioned the Jewish population. On September 13, Jewish publications were banned, among which the Új Kelet newspaper from Kolozsvár and Népünk from Nagyvárad. The activity of Jewish sport clubs and non-religious associations like the Transylvanian Jewish National Union, Erdélyi Zsidó Nemzeti Szövetség in Hungary, were suspended. The remaining Jewish religious press, by its nature, was not able to fulfill the role of political and public newspapers. The later attempts to relaunch the Jewish papers were not successful. As I mentioned, the general provisions of the second anti-Jewish law were applied before promulgation of the Prime Minister's decree from March 1941. Already under the military administration, there were suspended tobacco and liquor selling permits, and in many places began the limitation below 6% of the proportion of Jews in liberal professions. In Szatmár, for example, in October 1940, were revoked the licenses from Jews and were closed the Jewish-owned restaurants. The military administration, in many cases, put Christian administrators to run Jewish-owned companies and small factories. They were restricted the commercial activities of companies by refusing to issue transportation permits. Later, in autumn of 1940 and in early 1941, Jewish vendors were not permitted in marketplaces and fairs. In March 14, 1941, there was adopted the decree number 1940 from 1941 of the Prime Minister, which extended the terms of the second anti-Jewish law on Jewish landed properties in northern Transylvania. The exclusion process of the Jewish lawyers and doctors had begun prior to the reorganization of the Northern Transylvanian Professional Chambers in 1941. Immediately after the return of Northern Transylvania to Hungary, already in September 1940, the military authorities began to prepare lists with lawyers and rank them in accordance to their national behavior in the time of Romanian era. Lawyers, many of them Jews, accused of anti-Hungarian behavior or communist sympathy, were forbidden from practice. The Northern Transylvanian Professional Chambers were reorganized after the Second Vienna Award in 1941. Contrary to the case of Upper Hungary, Felvidék, where the 6% limitation was not applied immediately after the re-annexation of the Jewish. After the re-annexation, the Jewish quota was enforced in northern Transylvania from the very beginning. There was an exception in one profession. Northern Transylvania experienced a shortage of physicians, as half of the doctors had Jewish origins. Applying of the Jewish quota would have meant a severe crisis in the public health care. The military administration and later the civil administration did not stop to introduce exclusionary measures in professions, but started to arrest people with different charges, and the evictions and exclusions started also in 1940. The Transylvanian Jews who lost their Romanian citizenship in 1938 were in greater danger. They were considered aliens by the Hungarian authorities. For example, a carpenter from Nagyvárad named Vilmos Márton was arrested and deprived of his citizenship. A taxi driver from Beszterce was declared alien because he could not prove that he had Romanian citizenship between the two world wars. He was obliged to check in at the local police every week. Others suffered more. In October 1940, about 100 Jewish inhabitants were gathered from Csíkszereda and later from Borsig and from other secular settlements and transported over the Hungarian-Soviet border near Körösmező. At the end of 1940, the Hungarian authorities exposed 82 civilians from Máramarossziget. Around 89% of them were Jews. The negative experiences of the years right after the Second Vienna Award and of course the Holocaust created a serious break in the Transylvania-Hungarian Jewish relations. In September 1940, shortly after the reannexation of the territory, two former Zionist leaders, József Fischer and Erdél Marton, have sent a memorandum to the Prime Minister Pál Teleki. They sought to clarify their positions regarding the new geopolitical situation. The memorandum asked for a fair policy and indulgence towards the Transylvanian Jews. Fischer and Marton pointed out that contrary to the Saxons, the Transylvanian Jews, including the Zionists as well, did not support Transylvania's unification with Romania in 1918. They also stressed that during the 22 years of Romanian rule, adherents of the Jewish national movement also stood by the Hungarian affairs and supported the Hungarian culture. But the memorandum of the two Jewish leaders had no effect. A significant part of Transylvanian Hungarian political and intellectual elite proved to be partner in the exclusion of the Jews. György Pál, a deputy of the Transylvanian Party, published a newspaper article in December 1940 in which he divided the Transylvanian Jewry into three categories: pro-Hungarians, neutrals, and hostiles to Hungarians. According to him, the turning point was in the Hungarian-Jewish relations the year 1938, when the Hungarian party made electoral arrangement with an anti-Semite Romanian party. From then on, most of the Transylvanian Jews became indifferent and hostile against Hungarians. This kind of categorizations and the blame that the Transylvanian Jews had betrayed the Hungarians in the interwar period served for the basis of the indifferent and many times hostile behavior of the Christian population during the deportations in 1944. The new ideological orientation of the Hungarian political elite was reflected in the platform of the Transylvanian Party, a single legally admitted political party in northern Transylvania. The party's program, adopted in May 1941, stated that Transylvanian Jews turned away from the Hungarians between the two world wars. As a consequence, the Transylvanian Party will approve and use any governmental measures that aims to exclude the Jewish population from social, economic, and political life. How much?
Very short.
Okay, so I skip a part of my paper and I just read some my conclusions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The entering Hungarian army was welcomed everywhere by the local Jewish population in northern Transylvania. In September 6, 1940, there was held a worship in the Neolog synagogue in Nagyvárad, where the participants were deeply moved when they heard the national anthem of Hungary, first time after 22 years. The northern Transylvanian Jews hoped in a restoration of the old Hungarian times, but the return to Hungarian assimilationist road was no longer possible because of the exclusion and social isolation of the Jews. As we had seen, the anti-Jewish laws were applied in 4 steps in northern Transylvania. The general regulations of the Hungarian Second Anti-Jewish Law were implemented by the Act 26 of 1940 issued on October 8, 1940, and by the Prime Minister's decree in October 31, 1940, on the administrative organization of Northern Transylvania. Subsequently, in March 14, 1941, there was adopted the decree which extended the terms of the second anti-Jewish law on Jewish landed properties in Northern Transylvania. While the final regulation took place on March 27, 1941. Thus, the complete implementation of the Hungarian anti-Jewish legislation took altogether several months in Northern Transylvania, and meanwhile there have occurred major changes in the Hungarian-Jewish relations. The Transylvanian Party has made it clear that the North Transylvanian Jews were no more considered political partners. The so-called interval loyalty contract between the Hungarian Party and the Transylvanian Jews was broken up. Between the two world wars, all Jews who declared themselves Hungarians and had been involved in minority issues were considered part of the Hungarian minority. Following the Second Vienna Award, there was no more need for the partnership of the Jews.
Thank you very much, Attila. We're very short in time, but if one or two very short questions you can allow. Okay, so thank you very much. בוא להיות הפסקה של שעה, אני לא יודע...
מתי חוזרים?
אולי תוכלו לגשת למרצה באופן אישי. Something
לך זה לא בעיה. שושי. יש לה קשר עם הצאצאים של
השאלה זה לא אם הצאצאים, שלהם עצמם
וגם אני.